Recorded at an SO Night at the Opera, Barry Kosky's stunning production of Nabucco has aroused passionate controversy. It's been described as excessive, spectacular, and dynamic. The audience has adored it and abhorred it. Here's the chance to decide for yourself on Sunday's Stereo Special, simulcast on ABC Classic FM. The Australian Opera's Nabucco, 8:30 Sunday.
Good evening, I'm Maxine McHugh. When the people of Israel voted in a Conservative Likud government in May, the world wondered what it would mean for the Middle East peace process. Shimon Peres, the man who first saw peace as an opportunity rather than as a danger, had been forced to the political sidelines. In a remarkable career, Shimon Peres negotiated key diplomatic allegiances and set up Israel's nuclear defences. But the crowning achievement was his stewardship of the historic Oslo Peace Accord. Lateline brought you Australia's first interview with this exceptional statesman, and as part of our Best Of series, you can see that interview after the news.
Good evening, Indira Naidu with Late Edition News. A 41-year-old man has been charged over today's double shooting at a gem store in Melbourne. Manuel Adagian appeared in a Melbourne court a short while ago, charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder. He's alleged to have attempted to rob a gem store in the Century building at around midday. Police say during the robbery a father and son were killed and a woman critically injured. Ambulance officers at the scene said all the victims had been shot several times in the head at close range. A 4th man, believed to be a customer, witnessed the shootings but was not injured. Jailed business tycoon Alan Bonds pleaded guilty to 2 charges of failing to act honestly as a company director. The charges carry a maximum penalty of 5 years jail and relate to the stripping of more than $1 billion from Bell Resources in the late 1980s. Bond is already serving a 3-year sentence for art fraud handed down in August.
Bond's guilty pleas resulted from what the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions conceded was a deal.
I think that's obvious.
The 9 charges related to Bond Corporation's purchase of the Bell Group in 1988. Within the Bell Group was a cash-rich company called Bell Resources, which had $1.2 billion in the bank. Bond and others were charged with conspiring to systematically strip Bell Resources of that $1.2 billion and put it into the ailing Bond Corporation coffers. In the end, Bond pleaded guilty to 2 charges of dealing dishonestly as a company director with intent to defraud in relation to a $700 million transaction. The DPP then told the court that the prosecution would accept those pleas as a total discharge of the indictment against Bond, and that the Crown would no longer proceed with the other 7 charges. The guilty pleas bring a close to the actions against Bond arising out of the high-flying 80s.
Independent Senator Mal Colston has warned the government not to try to browbeat the Senate into passing its reforms. His comments come after the Senate again rejected cuts to welfare benefits for migrants, despite threats of a double dissolution.
To try to bludgeon the Senate to have those restored could result in the Senate really giving the Treasurer something to worry about.
The warning comes as the Prime Minister increases the heat over the Telstra sale, accusing his opponents of turning their backs on the environment. There was, however, one success for the government in the Senate today, with approval given for changes to higher education charges. In the upper house, angry words were exchanged over the significance of the latest national accounts figures. The Treasurer says they show budget forecasts are in good shape, while the opposition says the economy is still sluggish. The result did, however, help to pull the dollar out of its overnight dive, caused by comments by former Reserve Bank Governor Bernie Fraser.
Bernie Fraser's view that his former colleagues at the Reserve Bank should have made the last interest rate cut a full 1% rather than half that was not without risks to the dollar. Having climbed from around 79 US cents a week ago to 82 cents yesterday, Mr Fraser's remark sent it tumbling 3 cents overnight. The currency today climbing back through 80 cents as 9:30 a.m. passed without a further rate cut. Peter Costello put the former governor in his place.
Mr Fraser does not have a role in setting monetary policy in this country.
Just the comments of a private citizen, he said. But buoyed by today's national... not so restrained when taking on his Labor counterpart.
0.8% growth, year growth 3.8%. And this was the ignoramus that was out saying the economy was flatter than the Nullarbor Plain.
The September quarter showing a solid 0.8% growth, producing 3.8% annually, thanks mainly to business investment and exports.
The uncertainty over the dollar and a lower gold price saw the Australian share market slip today. The All Ordinaries Index fell 9.5 points to close at 2,370. Overseas, Japanese share prices were up, the Nikkei gaining 29 points. On the currency market, the dollar has made a partial recovery after the overnight sell-off. And finally, the touring Wallabies have been given a special honour. Afternoon tea with the Queen at Buckingham Palace. A tradition on Wallaby tours, it was David Campisi's last visit to the palace. He bids farewell to the international rugby stage on Monday morning, our time, with a match against the Barbarians. Now a brief look at tomorrow's national weather. Afternoon or evening storms for Darwin and Adelaide, mainly fine in Perth and fine in the other capital cities. And that's the latest news. I'm Indira Naidu. Good night.
In 50 years of politics, Israel Shimon Peres, the man who initiated the Middle East peace process, has been politician, strategist and philosopher.
Peres is a person who very much believes in change and is a tremendous innovator.
He does not hate the other side. He does not hate his enemies.
But not all Israelis were prepared to back Peres and his vision for peace, pushing him and his Labour government from office.
The fact that the Jews in such large numbers voted against him and against what he represented, which was a peace process, has cut very, very deeply into his soul.
The Middle East through the eyes of the peacemaker. That's our story tonight.
From Sydney, the ABC's Late Line. Here's Maxine McHugh.
Hello and welcome to the second of Late Line's Best of 96 programs. When images of Palestinian police, their guns trained on Israelis, flashed around the world in October, no one was more horrified than the country's former Prime Minister, Shimon Peres. The Palestinians had been armed under a peace agreement negotiated by him. The clash was the culmination of several weeks of the worst violence inside Israel for 30 years. It was a very real signal the accord between the Israelis and the Palestinians was disintegrating. Had Shimon Peres won last May's election, things might have been different. As Defence Minister, he'd overseen the signing of the interim agreement with Egypt in 1975. As Foreign Minister, he'd negotiated the famous 1993 Oslo Accord with the Palestinians. A year later came an agreement with Jordan. He won international accolades and a Nobel Peace Prize. But at home, he didn't have the complete trust of his countrymen. Faced with the choice, Israelis opted for the tough-talking Benjamin Netanyahu. So what happened to Shimon Peres' dream of peace? In a moment, that interview from October, but first this profile by Bronwyn Reid.
Sometimes history is made in simple moments. Last November, Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres embraced at a peace rally and together stumbled their way through a folk song. It was an electrifying sight to those who knew of the decades of bitter rivalry between them. But in 3 years, the duo had pursued peace for Israel and become a powerful political odd couple.
Historically, they were in a kind of a wrestling hold in which neither of them could any longer envisage life in politics without the other. They were bound together to rise and fall together.
The assassin's bullets meant for both men changed everything. Yitzhak Rabin, written into history as a martyr for peace. For Shimon Peres, the survivor, a new challenge to protect a legacy that suddenly seemed as fragile as life itself. It's said that the greatest acts of statesmanship are often accidental. Shimon Peres discovered the truth of that in picturesque Norway in 1992. He'd sanctioned two mild-mannered Israeli academics to open secret talks with the PLO in Oslo. The so-called Norway Channel led to the peace deal which saw Israel and the PLO recognise each other's existence, an end to the PLO's armed struggle, and in return, land and gradual Palestinian self-rule in the West Bank and Gaza.
He's a man who's not afraid of original new ideas. The basic problem when it comes to negotiations and when it comes to create a different future is that people really don't believe that change is possible. Peres is a person who very much believes in change and is a tremendous innovator.
You know, he does not hate the other side. He does not hate his enemies. He is willing to have a peace with his enemies. You know, he was a very tough negotiator. You know, he is the leader of Israel. He was the leader of Israel. But he expressed understandings for the national dignity of the other side, of the Palestinian people.
The Oslo Accord ultimately brought the fruits of international recognition. Rabin regarded as the hawk and Peres the dove. What's often overlooked in this scenario is that in his early career, Peres, while never serving in the army, was a formidable warrior for Israel. He achieved then a reputation for toughness that would allow him the luxury later of taking risks for peace. Entering politics in his early 20s, Peres helped build the country's defence industry. First, he negotiated the unwritten Paris-Tel Aviv military alliance that allowed Israel to modernise its army despite an international arms embargo. Then, in 1956, as the French and British prepared to punish Egypt for daring nationalise the Suez Canal, Peres offered them Israel's covert strategic support. It was a masterstroke. The gesture gave Peres leverage to establish Israel as a nuclear power, gaining the technology and know-how from France to commission a nuclear reactor project at Dimona.
It's something very deep in Israel's political psyche that peacemaking today, all right, peacemaking in the 1990s is predicated on the fact that although Israel is very small and very and has a very small population relative to the vast ocean of Arab and Islamic states in this region, Israel is very strong because it has nuclear capacity. And Shimon Peres was the architect of that.
An intellectual, a lover of poetry, technology and philosophy, Peres later learned more intricate methods of enhancing security. With the best record of any Israeli finance minister, he came to support economic development between Arab and Jew. His vision, a European-style common market in the Middle East, with joint enterprises and open borders instead of ceasefire lines.
He is very much looking at the Middle East from a regional point of view. What happens in conflict, obviously, that the region breaks up into various conflicts. There was a Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Jordanian, the Israeli-Syrian conflict. We had to create, and we want to create, and it's very much his vision, to create a new Middle East where the people of the Middle East can actually, instead of being victims of conflict, be the beneficiaries of cooperation.
For now, in the post-Oslo Middle East, Israel's borders, excluding the occupied territories, are accepted by the Palestinian Authority and the Egyptian and Jordanian governments. The rest of the Arab world is unrelentingly hostile. Syria, though, was to be next on the Peres list of historic peace agreements, but the feared fundamentalism intervened. Bombs in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem early this year, exploded by Islamic extremists wanting an end to the peace process, killed 70 people. In the carnage lay the trust many Israelis had in a Peres-style peace. In the subsequent election campaign, the 72-year-old elder statesman was portrayed as a mellowed, vulnerable leader. prepared to give too much for peace.
They voted against Peres because they wanted a different pace to the peace process. That under Shimon Peres and under Rabin beforehand, change had been so tumultuous, so rapid, so dynamic, so uncontrolled in the minds of these voters that they wanted it to be slowed down.
But for a man deigned to lead by no less than Israel's founding father, David Ben-Gurion, this rejection was personal.
The fact that the Jews in such large numbers voted against him and against what he represented, which was a peace process, has cut very, very deeply into his soul.
Peres, the man to whom the solutions are obvious, must now watch and wait, while others revisit visions for Israel and peace that he long ago rejected.
That report from Bronwyn Reid. And now to our guest, Mr. Shimon Peres, who joins us from Tel Aviv. Shimon Peres, welcome to Late Line.
Good morning or good evening, whatever it is, the time in Australia.
Thanks for joining us. Mr. Peres, when you reflect on the events of the last 12 months, the assassination of Mr. Rabin, Labour's election defeat, and of course the violence of the last couple of weeks, it must strike you that events once again are conspiring to defeat the goals of the peacemakers.
You know, I've learned the hard way that peace is not poetry. It is not singing a song. It's a very trying and costly and occasionally sad way. To answer your question a little bit longer, I would say, when I look back on the year that has passed, I saw the assassination of Rabin before my eyes. I went through 4 or 5 explosions that were terrible, you know. Many people were killed, many people injured. There were thousands of people around them. They accused me of being a traitor. They point the finger at me that I should be blamed for it. Then we have had the shelling in the north by the Hezbollah. And it was a very difficult year, very sad year, full of blood and defeats and setbacks. Yet, it was said